All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We are just about ready to get started. Thank you for joining us for secondary trauma and traumatic stress. My name is Alicia Lord, and I am with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. And as your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the WebEx platform and provide you with a few announcements to keep in mind. Coming up, you should see a poll listed on the side of the WebEx platform asking you to rate your current knowledge of today's topic. So please take a moment to answer that as we go through some housekeeping items. Please note that today's event is being recorded. Our webinar will be linked to OJJDP's YouTube page, and it will also be posted on OJJDP's Multimedia page. Past webinar events are archived on OJJDP's YouTube page, and for transcript and support materials, you can contact the OJJDP TTA Help Desk at the email listed on this slide. If you have any trouble uploading the event materials today, which I will bring up now, you can let us know in the chat, and my colleague will also be putting a link to the materials in the chat box via Google Drive, so you are able to see and download the presentation materials for today's event. Just 1 second, let me bring that up for you. Oh, looks like it's not sharing, so I will bring that up later. Okay, we will move on. All right, at the end of today's webinar, our Shift colleagues will be putting a link to join a Q&A session that will take place next week. So please feel free to use the chat feature today to enter in any questions and select all panelists before hitting send. But I just wanted to note that the questions may not be answered today, but we will be getting to them in a separate session next week. All right, for those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute to help us count. So if you're viewing by yourself, there's no need to type anything at this time, but if you're viewing in a group, please go to the chat window now and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. All right, and attendees signed in will receive a feedback email directly from WebEx with a certificate of attendance. And if you're joining as a part of a group, you can fill out the group validation form and send it to ojjdptta@usdoj.gov, and we'll put that email in the chat box for you as well to request a certificate of attendance. All right, and this is our general agenda for today. Thank you again for joining us for the presentation. We have one more poll that we'd like you to respond to before we get started. If you would please let us know how you intend to incorporate this information in your work, that would be great. And I will now turn it over to Basilia from Shift for today's webinar. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and my apologies. I'm having some technical issues with my camera right now, but I hope everyone can hear me well. My name is Basilia Padilla, and I am the program coordinator with the SHIFT program here at the Innocent Justice Foundation. And today we're just going to go ahead and go over a brief overview of what secondary trauma is and traumatic stress and how it can affect us. So just to give you a quick overview of the Innocent Justice Foundation was founded in 2007, and we are funded by OJJDP. And we are here to support ICAC teams and their affiliates in hopes that we can provide some tips and tricks for them to mitigate their stress that they have to deal with. Throughout our relationship, we've understood the heavy burden that law enforcement officers have to face. And, you know, we want to provide them a space where they can have some tools to mitigate their stress and normalize asking for help. So again, for today's webinar, we're just going to briefly touch what secondary trauma means and a little bit about traumatic stress and some tools for that. I will be keeping an eye on the chat, so if you have any questions, feel free to type those in the chat. And we also have a webinar series that's upcoming. So we're going to touch on some of the specific signs and symptoms, for example, of physical signs, cognitive signs, emotional signs, behavioral and worldview signs. And then my colleague Michelle will be dropping that information in the chat as well. So feel free to join us. And as Alicia mentioned, we also are going to have a Q&A session next week on the 8th with Jade and Alan, where we can answer any additional questions that we may not have had the opportunity to get to today. So again, feel free to join us there, and my colleague Michelle will be dropping that link in the chat at the end of the session. I'm going to go ahead and pass it along to our wonderful trainers. So take it away, Jean.
Thank you, Basilia. My name is Jean Mcallister, and when we do this training, we typically do a partnership between law enforcement or a service provider in whatever arena we're dealing with and a mental health provider. And I'm serving as the mental health provider proportion today. And I've been working on helping people address secondary trauma and vicarious trauma throughout my career. And so I'm really excited to be here today. I think the SHIFT program is amazing. And one of the things I want you to know is that we have learned so much about how to address trauma and secondary trauma since I started doing this work, that it's really, really powerful in terms of our ability to practice wellness and do much better self-care over time. This is an introduction, so that's where we'll start. And so you have a sense of my background. I have been in the field for over 40 years, and I still feel resilient and happy about the work I do. I enjoy it very much. I worked in child protection when I was younger. I worked for about 10 years in a domestic violence program that had a 24-hour crisis shelter, a crisis line, and a counseling program. I worked as a psychotherapist at West Pines Lutheran Medical Center here in Denver, Colorado, for a number of years, and worked in a specialized trauma treatment program called the Assault Survivors Assistance Program. I also have administered Colorado's Sex Offender Management Board and Domestic Violence Offender Management Board, was the executive director of the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and served as Title IX coordinator at the University of Denver. I currently have my own business. I do training, consulting, and expert testimony, and so I'm often working on the same cases that all of you may touch in other arenas. So that's just a little bit about my background, and I'm going to turn it over to Alan now.
I'm Alan Flora. My law enforcement career spanned from 1991 until my retirement in 2021. I started out as a uniformed deputy sheriff in a rural North Carolina sheriff's office. And then the remainder of the time, I was a special agent with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, or SBI. As an SBI agent, I worked at general criminal investigations, rapes, robberies, homicides. Did a 5-year stint as a fire and arson investigator. And in 2007, had an opportunity to transfer to the Computer Crimes Unit as part of the Internet Crimes Against Children, or ICAC task force. I was asked in 2007 if I would make a 3-year commitment because of the expensive training and the time it took to get up to speed in the ICAC world. And I very confidently told the boss in 2007, I won't just do 3, I'll give you 5, but then I'm gone. Because I knew from experience that for me, 5 years was kind of that burnout point where I had to move to something else. So that was 2007. 8 years later, I became the commander of the North Carolina ICAC task force. And from 2015 until 2021, had the pleasure of serving as the commander of the state task force and leading the SBI Computer Crimes Unit for the North Carolina. That was without question the most meaningful work that I ever had to be a part of. So along with that, let me say this. I spent the first 24 years of my career somewhat ignorant of mental wellness issues. It just wasn't something we talked about back then. In fact, we actively didn't talk about it. There was a stigma attached to that. And I took a SHIFT class in 2016. And that was my first deep dive into this. And once it hit me what I had been missing, and more importantly, what I wasn't giving my team, I really dove deep into it. By 2019, I wasn't just taking classes, I was teaching them. And then last year, I actually went back to school full time when I retired, and I earned a master's degree with my concentrations, my thesis work focusing on vicarious trauma and the effects of this work on the ICAC task force. And I show you that just because it's been a journey. And for me, even though I've now left law enforcement, it's incredibly important that I still be a part of the mission. And this is what I've chosen as my way to be a part of the mission. And I'm going to be very open and honest with you today about things that I've done right and things that I've done wrong. And I hope that by sharing that, you can find some value in hearing what worked for me and what didn't, and maybe apply it to your own lives. So, what if we told you that sometimes we don't see it coming? No surprise there, right? You know, the nature of our work is that there's always something looming out there with the potential to overwhelm us. And it's important that we prepare for those big events. But it's also important to understand that the stressors that we're dealing with can build up gradually. And we need to learn how to recognize and manage traumatic events so that this experience prepares us for whatever it is that we don't see coming.
And then I want to just let you know that we're going to talk about today some really basic, everyday tools and techniques to help shield yourself and develop your resilience so that you can do your job and maintain your quality of life and positive relationships with the people who matter to you, whether those are family, friends, or colleagues. And I want to remind you also that we'll take deeper dives into each arena in the future webinars that we're having about this, but this is sort of an overview. So we're focusing on basic tools today, and hopefully you'll have some things to take with you to be able to do your work. And the way we're going to focus on that, or our agenda, an overview of what we're going to cover, is we'll have an introduction to vicarious trauma and traumatic stress. We will explain how the body responds to trauma and stress, because it's really important to understand that trauma isn't just psychological. It's both physiological and psychological, the way it impacts us. We'll talk about the physical signs and symptoms of traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, and then we'll talk about resilience, that ability to bounce back, to take care of yourself, to operate well in the face of difficulty. And we'll give you some tools and techniques to reinforce your resilience and cope with trauma as you move through your work.
So I want to reiterate this, that, you know, there has been somewhat of a stigma in the past about talking about mental health and mental wellness and how do we feel. And it's really important to us that we smash that stigma. It needs to be normal. If you're having a rough day, if you feel overwhelmed or undersupported, it's okay to say it. In fact, it's encouraged to say it. So let's ask you this question right up front. What causes you the most stress at work? Spelled BOSS, or however you want to put it. What causes you the most stress at work? And we'd like to get some chat responses here.
Paperwork, that's a big one. Caseloads, that's something we hear overall. While micromanaging, deadlines, lack of communication, client experiences, court, that's not uncommon for people to hate going to court. High caseloads and the resulting feeling stressed about being behind. Difficult cases.
I noticed micromanagement.
Yep.
That's an issue that's pretty important to me. I really believe in empowering people. We work so hard to get the best possible applicants and the best candidates, and we hire these super qualified people. It makes no sense to me why a manager would then turn around and micromanage them, because you've purposely picked people who should be capable of doing the job. I'm a big believer in empowering people to go do their work and getting out of their way.
And it sounds like also there's another theme where people are feeling like there's either not enough training or there's not enough training for people up the food chain in ways that they can support your work better. And that there's a lot of pressure to keep doing more and more and more. And in the face of these huge caseloads and really difficult cases. COVID's had an impact as well, and I think that's important.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. This is really wonderful because you all are identifying the common themes we see throughout the work that we do, no matter where we are and no matter which component of working with abused or traumatized or sexually exploited youth people are dealing with.
And I want to say thank you for the feedback. And even if you're saying something that seems common, right? Like heavy caseload. Well, I think it's important because, right now I see 939 participants. Well, the fact that you put that there, there's 938 other participants who can nod their head and say, yeah, me too. So it's good that you're putting the feedback, and it's also good for each of us to look at that and kind of say, yeah, I'm not the only one that feels that way.
Yep.
So thank you for participating.
We really appreciate it.
Not knowing if victims end up okay in the end. Let me throw that back to you as well. It's so important to get that feedback. You work really hard, and if you're in a lab situation or if you're an analyst with NCMEC, for instance, and you don't get the feedback, I do think that's not in today's lesson, but that's a great point to bring up, that if you have any means to get feedback, whether it be feedback on a cyber tip or whatever it would be, you should fill that out, because there's somebody who worked really hard who wants to know if that kid's okay.
And one of the questions we had before the video today is, what can supervisors do to help support their staff? And that is one of the things. If you have people who work on the front end and don't know outcomes, figuring out a way to give them feedback about outcomes is going to be a way to support them and lessen their traumatic stress over time. So we're going to move on now, and you can keep writing in the chat as long as you like, because we'll keep that information and use it as we go along. One of the things I want to describe for you is, what is vicarious trauma? It is the whole constellation of things that happen to us neurologically. Some people would identify that as cognitively, so to our thinking, our physical being, our psychological well-being, our emotional responses, and our spiritual health, when you either listen to or respond to or work with traumatic stories or traumatic situations on a regular basis, and you are not able to address your own responses in the moment. One of the things about our work is it requires professionalism. It requires that we continue to fulfill our role and do the job that we need to do, even when something is really troubling to us. So we often end up with sort of an extra load of trauma that's not been adequately processed. And that's something that we're going to talk about today. How do you stop in little moments throughout the day, in small ways, and address some of these responses so they don't pile up on you and make things worse over time? Because there are ways to do that without, falling apart or becoming unprofessional, and we know a lot more about how to do them. I also want to mention another topic, which is chronic stress, and Alan's going to talk you through that one.
So when we talk about chronic stress, we're talking about this response to pressure over prolonged periods of time. And it can result in this negative consequences, both mentally and physically. The thing I want to say about this is that you don't really feel it necessarily, or you don't understand how intense it is, but it's building up. And if you're not managing it, it really has a tendency to weigh you down mentally, physically. It can weigh on you in many different ways. A lot of health consequences. If there are any backpackers or hikers attending today, I would kind of equate it to this. You've got this long trek and you've got a 40-pound pack or whatever, it goes. And it gets to the point where maybe it's not even fun anymore. You're just trudging along. You're just trying to get to the end. And you're bearing the weight. And when you finally get there and you take the pack off, there's this incredible sensation of almost weightlessness. And you're like, wow, I had no idea how much I was even carrying. Now, my perspective is a little different on this because I retired last year. And I can tell you that even now, I'm really just figuring it out. My personal journey as far as, how do I recognize what's going on with me? The classes that I took, I'm learning a lot about it. But I think it is surprising at times when we realize just how much weight we've been carrying. So again, a lot of what we're talking about today, we can't necessarily take the weight off of you, but what we can do is help you to recognize what you're carrying. And by learning to understand it and manage it, you can get to the end, if you will, of that trek in a much more healthy way.
That's wonderful, Alan. And I just want to acknowledge before we move on something in the chat. Somebody is talking about having a really smooth system and a strong team that works together to avoid stress. And I want to acknowledge that because that's an incredible accomplishment, and it's also possible for every one of us. And that's why we're doing these webinars, why we teach the things we teach, because it is possible to build that kind of a system for yourself and your team. And so I want to celebrate that when we see it, because one of the things that happens is our work is we focus on the negative an awful lot. And it's really important that we pay attention to the positive when it comes our way. We focus on the negative because we're trying to prevent crime and address trauma that has happened as a result of crime. But we also need to celebrate the good things. And that's an important component of moving forward. So our responses during exposure to trauma are going to be the same whether we're a primary recipient of trauma or whether we are vicariously experiencing it by witnessing it on screen, dealing with victims, dealing with offenders, dealing with these cases. I really want to acknowledge that because in the old days, we used to think you only got distressed if you were the primary recipient of the trauma, but we now know that our bodies and minds respond in the same way to traumatic material, whether or not we're witnessing it, we're aware of it, or the primary recipient. And there are basic survival responses that happen to all of us whenever we perceive trauma. And that is identified as something that's so powerful, harmful, threatening, or severe for ourselves or someone else that it overwhelms our existing ability to cope, and we use what are called extraordinary coping behaviors. And physiologically, what happens when we witness trauma is our brain chemistry changes. We literally dump a bunch of chemicals into our system, adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, that change how our brains function and then how our bodies function. And the first thing it does is it limits our access to this part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part where we have learning and previous ability, and it shunts the operation of our bodies and brains to a more primitive part of the brain that's really focused on survival and survival of big threats. And it does this, again, whether you're looking at something on a screen or whether you're actually out responding to something in the world and you could be in real physical danger. And we have three primary responses physiologically when that happened. Those survival responses in our culture, we typically talk about as fight or flight. But there are actually three that happen very commonly: fight, flight, and freeze or lack of response. Makes sense that if you can fight off who's ever hurting someone or the bad thing that's happening, that you're not going to get hurt and you're going to be okay. makes sense to us that if you can escape the bad thing that's happening or get somebody who's being hurt out of it, they're going to be okay. And that's flight. So that makes sense to us. We believe the freezing response is related to our experience as primary prey animals before we had weapons that were very effective. And we know that large predators will very often see movement rather than detail. And so if you stay still when a large predator is in the area, they might not see you and they might smell you but walk right by because they don't catch any movement going on. So that can be protective of you. What's important to understand about this is when we have successful fight or flight responses, we use up some of those nasty stress chemicals that help us survive, and we then are able to have less long-term negative response from the trauma. When we end up having an immobility or freezing response, we have to work harder to complete the trauma response, and we are more likely to have long-term negative impact. And just for those of you that work with people, in most cases where you're looking at a screen or you're sitting with a client or you're dealing with somebody in court, any of those things, your body can experience that as freezing rather than as a successful fight or flight response. So we have to really teach ourselves to understand what successful flight and fight responses are and to undo if we've had a freezing response. And then there are two psychological responses that we also use regularly during trauma. The first one is called anxiety, and it is those distressed, disgusted, overwhelmed, negative emotion, shaking, crying, feeling terrible, something that really overtly upsets you that you can feel and experience. The other normal response during trauma is called dissociation. And that simply means you are literally compartmentalizing or setting aside all or part of your experience of a negative event. And when that is happening, you are not fully taking in what's happened. And I kind of equate these. The way to understand them is in a physical injury, pain is like the anxiety response. It gets your attention. And shock, which shuts down your system, slows your heart rate, drops your blood pressure, drops your body temperature, stops you from absorbing the full negative impact of the event so you don't bleed to death. Dissociation is like that for your mind. It shuts down your ability to absorb the full negative impact of the trauma, and it protects you from going crazy in the moment because something so terrible is happening. And those are normal responses during trauma, and they're protective for us during traumatic events. When they're not protective is if we keep having them or they start happening when we're not experiencing trauma and nobody's at risk or in danger. So we're going to talk next a little bit about traumatic information storage. Some people asked, how do I tell when something's happening and I'm traumatized, but I usually don't notice until I'm way overwhelmed? So this is one of the ways we can tell. Remember that the primitive part of your brain is working when you experience trauma. So we don't have formal control over being able to recall something or put something away the same way we do about general information that's stored in our prefrontal cortex. And sometimes it's triggered by cues in the environment. So one of the things that can happen if somebody's been sexually assaulted and someone came up behind them, which is unusual in sexual assault, but somebody else comes up behind them in an elevator or on a stairway, they may be really reactive. Think about those circumstances where you've been working with a certain kind of case that was really troubling, and then you get another client with very similar circumstances. sometimes that brings up the old memory. I responded extensively to the Columbine High School shootings, and people talked about literally driving by that high school years after would bring up trauma responses for them. So when you have something that intrudes on your memory or your thought that reminds you of something traumatic, that's an indicator that there's something there that's unprocessed that needs to be addressed. The other thing to know about how traumatic material is stored is it's primarily stored as sensory information. So images or pictures, physical sensations like smell or sound, or if you think about an Iraqi vet or an Afghani vet who's been on multiple tours, on the 4th of July, if they hear a firecracker exploding, they may have a very visceral reaction that wants them to dive to take cover because they're smelling gunpowder, they're hearing that sound, and it may remind them of being at risk in war, literally. But when they can pull out of the trauma response, they can realize it's the kid next door shooting off a firecracker. But in the moment, it can feel very overwhelming. Emotions are also sensory information, and behaviors. And when we have behaviors in our work that we have to do over and over again, sometimes those get stored that way. Or we see behaviors if we're seeing the way clients behave, if we're seeing the way people behave in certain settings, or if we're witnessing things online, electronically. All of those things can be triggers. And sometimes they're stored as discrete pieces of information. So if you find that kind of information, images popping into your head when you don't want them to be, when you're home instead of at work, things like that are indicators of unaddressed trauma. And then we're going to talk briefly about what happens during the trauma response. The fear center, that amygdala, that primitive part of your brain that runs our responses, is activated. Interoception centers, the insula, can become hyperactivated. That's when you kind of are overactively scanning or hyper aroused, looking for trouble all the time. And we see that a lot in law enforcement and in people who respond to victims. They start acting as if the whole world is dangerous because they are so often triggered in that way. Your typical memory center, where you have, dates, times, order of events, cognitive detail, and the ability to tell a story from beginning to end, goes offline some. And your ability to regulate your emotions is less active. So if you find yourself having more than needed emotional response to things, or for instance, when I'm in the car, I'm typically happy because I have some downtime and I am not needing to respond to anyone. So if I find myself angry at other drivers, that's usually an indicator to me that I have some unintegrated trauma that I need to work with, because it's not a typical response for me. And you may find yourself having physical responses too. So think about things like, do you get a sick feeling in the pit of your stomach? Do you start sweating? Do you feel thirsty? Does your heart rate go up? Do you start to worry, or do you start to isolate, or are you finding difficulty sleeping or having your sleep disrupted? Those can all be signs and symptoms that you have some unaddressed trauma. Anything you want to share about sort of these trauma responses, Alan, or do you want to move on?
Now we can move on to the next one. Just I wanted to acknowledge, just looking at the list of attendees, I see a really broad range, and that's great. We've got people who are internet crimes against children or ICAC investigators. I see, from what I can tell, victim advocates, people that work at a women's center, just a huge range, people in education. So first of all, thank you so much for the diversity of our crowd here today. But I think I want to stress that what we're talking about applies to all of us. If you are in a situation where you're going to be a witness to what other people are dealing with, or help other people in trauma, or investigate evidence, or whatever it might be, you're in the right room today, because we all, at some point or another, are going to have to deal with a traumatic incident, whether it's happened to us or someone else, or a combination thereof, and we've got to process it. So our next slide is vicarious trauma. And the thing to understand about this, it's a gradual process, and it can sneak up on you. And it may even include compassion fatigue, which is where you just really lose the ability to care. The dangerous part about that, you hear the term burnout, but burnout usually applies to work. I'm burnt out at work, but I can take a vacation and I'm good. When you get into a situation with compassion fatigue, that's when you're at a point where you just lose the ability to care. Your caring muscles have just worn out, and you have, not that there's an actual muscle, but you know what I'm saying. It's like that translates not just at work, but you hear enough bad stuff and you just kind of deaden your emotions. Well, that also happens at home, and that's where it can really be a problem with family and loved ones. When you lose the ability to be sensitive and care about what's going on with others, that can cause serious problems. So, there's a potential for this to be a permanent thing, but the most important part there is that it can be prevented, it can be stopped. Now, I'm going to tell you, you cannot avoid trauma in the work that we do. So we're not going to teach you a lesson today about how to avoid trauma, because that's the reality of what we've chosen to do. But you can manage it, and that's the key thing. You can recognize it, understand what's happening to you, and manage that. So that's a key thing about vicarious trauma. If you're in a helping profession, you're going to be helping people who hurt. If you are a good, decent person, you're going to hurt with them at some point or another. Now, we all try to block it out, but the fact is, if we're helping people who hurt, we're going to feel some of that hurt. That's just who we are. But we can manage this. So as we go through these stages, and we'll move to the next slide, I saw one of the comments earlier about how things build up gradually, and this next slide kind of says it. Things are okay, then they're not, and the comment someone had put, this thing builds up gradually, and then I'm really stressed. Well, that's kind of how it goes, and we have increasing caseloads when we're dealing with young victims, especially, and the younger, it seems like they just get younger. Abuse cases where the violence is just more sadistic. And you're dealing with all the different people here. And then if it goes through a court system and you don't feel like it was handled properly, or you don't feel like it was a just decision, these things kind of compound. And then when you're just really tired and disgusted of it all, well, and then it can get worse, So, excuse me. We'll move on to the next slide. It's like, now you're looking around and you're just really overwhelmed with it. And you realize I've got insufficient resources. A lot of these things we can't even get to. We're trying to triage cases and victims, and we can't possibly do them all. And there's limits on help. And I can tell you, as the manager of an ICAC unit, when I took over as the special agent in charge of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation Computer Crimes Unit in 2015, literally the first act was to submit memos about needing more intelligence analysts and trying to just get caught up. My very first thing, before I even left my home on day one, I was emailing a memo to the headquarters about, this is a crisis, this is critical. And that was an ongoing process that I had to constantly keep asking and keep drawing attention to it. And 2 years goes by, and I kept up the memos, and I kept saying it. And about 2 years in, we had a situation where we got a lead, a cyber tip from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC, that indicated there may be a problem in a home, and we had to triage it. We couldn't get to it. And a few months later, we got another lead about the same home, which had a video of a man molesting his 2-year-old son. And we didn't have that information the first time when it didn't make the triage pile, but it was still this tremendous weight on us. Like, oh my gosh, this went on for a couple months longer because we didn't have the resources to get there. So I walked across the street to headquarters and I go into the attorney's office and I said, hey, you know those memos I keep sending you? And there was a bit of a joke about, yeah, it's in the drawer with the next one. You got another one? And I was like, I just wanted to let you know what happened today. Well, that day, after 2 years of memos, suddenly a resource was found and a position was found, and we got another analyst. And I don't say that to badmouth my agency. I just say that because that's the reality of what we deal with. And this feeling that you don't have enough resources, it's a common theme because when you're asking for more people, you're asking for money that your agency probably doesn't have. And all I can tell you there is, we just keep fighting the good fight. But meanwhile, it hurts and it's stressful and it weighs on you. And the harder you work, the more you feel like nobody else cares. It's not that they don't care, but is a natural feeling. So I say all that, to tell you that this stuff is supposed to weigh on us, and it will. But if we understand what's going on and we can take that breath and we can, work through it, we can manage it and talk about our feelings with the others, and it's going to help us to get through these situations. So it's really not a matter of if, but when, we're going to be impacted by this stuff. And I don't mean to be negative. It's not that at all. I'm actually a pretty positive person. I've been in this for several years and I can't imagine doing anything else. That's why I'm still here. But you have to understand the negative will come, and there will be a time when you realize that your family is suffering. You're going to be stressed and your family's maybe going to point out to you that, you haven't really been here for us lately. In my house, when I would be stressed, we had a code word. My wife would tell me, you're being testy. And that's something that I've heard more than once. Jean laughs because she's heard me tell these stories several times, but we had that key word, Alan, you're being testy. And that was my wife's way of telling me that whatever stress I had carried home from work was being taken out on my children. Or maybe I was being a little bit too short with the kids when they were trying to explain something. And that was something that was actually helpful to me. I didn't reject that. I was good. But also your health, and you can even get to a point where your faith and your focus are questioned. When you're feeling really burnt out and tired, if you get to the point where you're questioning your faith, that is a difficult thing to deal with. And again, it really comes back to, you may not avoid this, but if you recognize what's happening, you can manage it. And I think that's a key to it, is learning how to manage the things that we deal with when you get to the point that it's happened.
And I want to acknowledge that. I also want to note something that was in the chat, and that we tend to feel like we have limited resources. And if we get traumatized and then we have to cope with it, then we have even less resources. I want to introduce a concept here that is really about resilience, and it's called post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic resilience. So there are ways to manage and deal with this and then build resilience so that you are not shrinking your world and your capacity over time, but you literally are figuring out how to transition to broadening your world again. That is possible. We have to first learn how to deal with the negative impacts, and then we have to learn how to build that positive resilience. So they go hand in hand, but it doesn't always mean that you just have to deal with less and more harm. There are really profoundly positive outcomes possible, and that's something I want to share with everyone before we move on. So one of the questions we get asked more often than not is, we deal with really horrible stuff. It's normal to have bad responses to that. When is my response normal and not problematic? When is there a warning sign that something really needs to be addressed? And when's somebody really in trouble? And I'm thinking about this in the context of the person who said in the chat, again, very honestly, and I'm so grateful, sometimes I feel like I have to get really in a bad place before I begin to address it, before I notice, because I'm so focused on the work. So this is one of the things that we talk about. There are basically sort of two um, scales that we look at when we are looking at this. How often is the thing happening? How persistent is it? And how intrusive is it? So it is very normal in our work to feel stressed because we have too much to do. It is very normal in our work to have to deal with something awful. And we think about it sometimes after work, or once in a while, we'll wake up from a bad case in the night, but we're not waking up every day. Those things are normal. It doesn't mean they don't need to be addressed. That's when you use some of the tools we're going to talk about later today. You use those tools regularly, and you have less of that ongoing impact. When Alan's talking about we can manage those things, he's telling you the truth. You really can do things that make that impact less. So that's kind of a normal response. But if something begins to be more persistent, it's not that your wife tells you you're being testy, or I start being angry at traffic in my car. It's that I can't get out of a bad headset, or I think everybody I meet is hurting some kid somewhere, or something like that. So if it starts to happen more often, for instance, waking up at night worrying about a case before a trial, or when you have a particularly difficult one or you haven't had a chance to respond to a kid yet, really normal if it happens once or twice. Let's say you wake up and you can't go back to sleep and it happens 2 or 3 nights in a row. That is a different impact, because what that means is you are also functioning with less sleep. It's harmed your interaction. Or you go home and your wife tells you that you're being testy and you pick a fight with her because you're really upset. And then you have troubled relationships at home, as well as that it's happening more often. So think about how intrusive it is. Do you get to work and you're usually pretty productive and you look at the stack of cases on your desk and you sit there for 10 minutes because you don't even know where to start today? That's having an impact that's more intrusive because it's impacting your work or your relationship or something about your physical health. And those are things that need to be addressed pretty immediately and pretty directly, not just with minor interventions, but to say, I really need to focus on this. I need to learn some new skills about how to go back to sleep if I wake up, or how to do better sleep skills around going to sleep. I think about something you did, Alan, which you can tell them when I'm done here, about the phone, that made a huge difference for you. And then trouble indicators are when something is really persistent or really intrusive. If it really is negatively impacting your relationships with your colleagues, your family members, you're having a lot of conflict at home, or your kids are looking at you saying, I think you care about more other kids than you do about me because you're spending so much time at work, or you're missing your kids' activities, not for a really difficult case, but multiple times a week. Those kinds of things are more serious trouble indicators. Serious depressions, those kinds of things we need to pay attention to, and often we need some outside help. One of the questions we had on the pre-questions was, how do I help my people? Where do I tell them to go? Looking for mental health providers that your insurance can cover is a great thing, but also mental health providers that your insurance covers who really understand the kind of work you do, so that people don't have to explain themselves, that you could refer someone to. And if you don't know where those people are, ask the victim advocates in your programs, because they refer victims to people who understand trauma treatment all the time. Think about some of those things you can do, but when you're in the red zone, you really may need some additional help, not just changing your own behavior. Alan?
You mentioned the phone, and that kind of comes back to when things become a problem, when it crosses beyond just being testy. And I think for me, it was I spent 3 decades on call basically. And there towards the end, it was just a constant feeling of, something is big is happening, something's going on. I'm running a statewide division. I've got, at any given time in the state of North Carolina, which for those that know our geography, to drive from one end of the state to the other, 7 or 8 hours. So I might have a team doing a search warrant in the Wilmington area and another team doing a search warrant in the Asheville area, but I'm actually at my house trying to have supper with my family because we've got things happening at all different points in the state, and I can't be everywhere. So there are times that I might be home, but my mind is somewhere else. And I remember one such night where I had operations going on, 4 hours in either direction of me, and my wife is just trying to tell me about her day, and my kids are trying to talk about what happened at school, and I was just oblivious to it. And my wife called me out on it, and she was like, even when you're here, you're not here. And that hurt to hear, but at the same time, it kind of was a reality check for me that the pressure of my work was just so dominant in my family's life. It wasn't just me. So I started trying to really examine how much of it I brought into the house. And I'm still on call and I'm still dealing with things, but like for instance, the phone, and we all know it, right? These things, let's just face it, they're the devil, but they have become so controlling to us. And one of the things I observed about myself was that the very last thing that I ever did before I went to sleep was put my phone down next to the bed. And the first thing that I did when I awoke, the very first thing was reach for the phone and start trying to catch up on the emails that I missed during the night. And that became a part of my life that I sadly lasted for several years. And when I finally realized it a couple years ago, it seems like such a simple thing, but I made a commitment to myself that I was going to at least put a foot on the floor and get out of bed, heaven forbid, maybe even go to the bathroom before I looked at my phone. And I had to really make an intentional commitment to not read email on my phone before I left the bedroom in the morning. And it seems like such a small thing, but it was huge in kind of getting back my life, getting back some sanity and some of the control that work had over me. It didn't lessen the load. I still had the same amount of work to deal with, but giving myself just that much grace to at least get out of the bedroom, walk into the kitchen, pour a cup of coffee, and then see what I was missing. That's still intruding on my home, but I will just say that, just taking back that moment. And whether it's that for you or something else, whether it's you just lay down the law, I will not have my phone at the table during a family meal. I will not check email before my foot hits the floor in the morning. You got to figure out what it is that's controlling you about work and separate that from your personal life. And that's a healthy coping mechanism that really went a long way towards me regaining me.
Thank you, Alan. That's so important to figure out those small things you can do that make a real difference for us. So, one of the things that we want to do, remember I said we often focus on the negative. I want you to list in the chat what some of your healthy coping mechanisms are. What are things you do that you know are good for you or that work for you or that help? It's as important to acknowledge, the gym, meditation in nature, running, therapy, exercise, walking, praying, crafting. I mean, this is beautiful. People are doing a good job of coping with some of this. I have to share the one about my dog because I have a dog who I adore as well, and he keeps me healthy. I can't not smile when I'm around him. This is so powerful. And I want you to think about that you are already doing some great things. One of the things we know about successful coping with trauma is that, and breathing, we're going to talk about that later. If you do a good job of actually acknowledging consciously when you're doing something well, or doing something that's helpful to you, any coping skill that's conscious and intentional is much more protective and helpful and much more likely to build resilience than if you do it unconsciously. Think about, you're in a situation, it's really ugly, you get overwhelmed, and you literally close your computer and walk away. Or you recognize that you're having a bad reaction, you stop, you say, I'm going to take a break to protect myself. You're in this part of your brain. You have stopped the chemical dump initiated by that primitive part of your brain, and you experience a successful flight response because you know you're leaving on purpose. This is so important that we think about doing things consciously and intentionally. Great questions in the chat about if we're continuing to work all the time. How is that protecting us? How is that helping us? And I think Alan's notes about saying we're going to do this a little differently. Even small boundaries help because it gives you some sense of control and some ability to move away from it, even when it's little. And I know that you need more staff and more people, but I also think Ellen's constant emails and constant messages about needing more staff, and then every time there's a problem, you take the problem that came up and you say, this grew out of not enough staff. And it can take forever to build that, but it matters when we're doing that.
In that case that I mentioned, it was literally from the time I started the campaign to get more analysts. And for us, what we need intelligence analysts for is to review the leads. And for those that don't understand, I know we have a huge range here. I'm really excited, by the way. I'm so excited about our attendee list today. I'm seeing people from law offices and probation officers and police officers and Goodwill Industries and United Way and just such a broad range. So that is fantastic. But so to put it in context, when a lead may go to, say, from Facebook, may detect something might be out of place, or Google detects something that appears to be an illegal file that maybe has child sexual abuse material, whatever, and they send that to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC, and then they filter that down to us, and that comes in the form of a lead called a cyber tip. Now, it seems simple enough. Someone says, hey, check this out, go check it out. The problem is they come by the thousands. So you have a staff of 20 people who might be trying to review 4,000 leads that have come in during the course of the year. It's not physically possible to do it. So you have to triage and pick out which ones you think are real and which are not. And to be fair, many of them are not crimes. They're things that don't look right, but they turn out to be nothing. So you try to shoot for the ones that look to be the most dangerous, but sometimes you miss. Sometimes something that looked rather inconspicuous turns out to be a serious thing. And that was the case that I mentioned. The point being that if we'd had more people, we could have had more folks to review things and put more time into it. But from the time I started in the fall of 2015 asking for personnel until I actually had an extra analyst in place and hired and actually working there, it was about a 4-year process. It was 2019. And it was one of my greatest victories, and it's made a tremendous difference. But that gives you an example of just how hard it can be, especially working within government, to get something, because everybody can agree we need more people, but no one wants to pay for it. So I want to move to the next slide, which is one of my favorites. It's what I like to call the Kelly Clarkson slide.
And we haven't done this one yet, though. So do you mind if we do this one?
Oh, I'm sorry. Nope, sorry, getting ahead of himself. I just love that next slide, but go ahead. Yeah.
And you can love it in just a minute. And
Okay.
I know we need to move quickly because we have so much material and very little time, but I do want to talk about the neuroscience of resilience. So there is something that we have called a window of tolerance. And that means that's where we operate fairly normal without those stress chemicals dumping into our system or without becoming overwhelmed or shut down. And that is broader for most of us who do work with people who've been traumatized than it is for most people, because we're a little acclimated to how hard things are in the world. But the reality is we all have one, and there are things periodically that kind of push us outside of that, where we have a trauma response or something. One of the things that helps us build resilience is to learn how to move back inside our window of tolerance, where we're not producing more stress chemicals in our system as quickly as possible when we are traumatized. And remember, I talked about cortisol as one of the chemicals that's dumped in our system when we have a trauma response. It's one, unfortunately, that if we don't address, stays in our system and causes physical harm. Why people end up with high blood pressure and weight issues and headaches and stomach aches and things like that as a result of stress. There are two ways to get cortisol out of our system. One is physical movement. So those of you who talked about walking your dog or running or going to the gym or taking a break and moving outside, any kind of movement is helpful. That's very powerful. The other way to get rid of cortisol is to engage oxytocin. It's a positive chemical that is like the antidote to cortisol. So it's called the connection chemical. Some people say it's the reason why women have second children, because it makes them forget the pain of having the child and just remember the love of the baby. It is something that dumps into our brains when we spend time with people we love, when we see our kids, our best friend, our colleagues who we trust and respect, our family members, any of those people, and our animals who we love. I notice many of you acknowledged pets. And the really wonderful thing about oxytocin is that person doesn't have to be in the room with you, giving you a physical hug to produce it. If you think deeply about somebody you care about, your physiology literally changes. The oxytocin helps you. I often will watch, when we're in a room full of people, I will ask people to think about who they love most in the world. And faces that have been tight and had frown lines start to relax. Some people start smiling. You literally change your brain chemistry when you think about people or animals that you are connected to and you love and respect. So that's something we can use anytime, anywhere to protect ourselves. You just want to be careful not to pair it with negative traumatic information so you don't get that thinking about your children makes you think about some horrible case. Alan, take it away, Kelly Clarkson.
Now's my favorite. This is the one I'm sorry, but I always love this one because it's the good news. We've kind of hit you for the first hour with, oh my gosh, this is heavy. And I'm telling you that, oh no, you can't escape this. Life's going to be hard. But this is my favorite part. It's that, when you go through this, you're building resilience. And that's really what we're going to focus on in the second part. When you go through trauma and you get through it, you come back stronger. And I think, of course, the Kelly Clarkson song where she's singing, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And in the past, I have actually sang that song, but the feedback was not good. So I'm going to just pass it on. But you just picture it, you think about it, and I really do think it would sound good. I love this so much just because we are constantly overwhelmed with the negative, the heavy. The fact is, we're better for it. We are stronger people. We took this on for a reason because we care about others and we want to help. Whatever it is that you're doing, you're in a helping profession, or you're somebody who cares about others, but you also need to take care of you. And that's an important lesson. But just understand that when you successfully manage this, you are stronger because of it. And then you're even better equipped to help others, which is what you got into it in the first place for.
Alan, you're getting kudos and wanting you to sing.
I'm
But
telling you,
I will attest to that it's probably not a great idea.
I'm on LinkedIn. Just find me, Alan Flora, on LinkedIn. We'll connect later. You just let me know.
And I just want to let you know that after 9/11, which is when they did the first research that really looked at the long-term impact of trauma and the difference between people who were doing well and people who were not doing well, long after the traumatic event, they found characteristics and things people engaged in that literally predicted resilience and doing well after some of the most horrific trauma our country had ever seen. And that was regardless of whether you were a first responder, a family member who lost someone, someone who was injured, or a community member. So it across the board, these things are things that make a huge difference in your ability to be resilient. And by far, the most powerful, more than anything else, is the presence and use of social support. So accessing the people around you who you care about and who care about you, colleagues, friends, family, and engaging with them. One of the questions we had earlier was, how do I get support from people without traumatizing them? We often make a fallacy that we have to tell people all the gory details, and we really don't, and we shouldn't unless they can do something about the gory details. Processing a case with your colleagues to figure out a plan, that's good, that's helpful. But otherwise, what you need to be talking about is, what was the impact? What did you feel? What do you need? Would help you get back inside your window of tolerance? What would help you feel good about the world again? So using that social support is the best thing you can do. If you learn one thing today, figure out how you connect with people who love you and care about you more. And then you'll notice that the other things are all things that naturally our work has us doing. So our work is protective, keeps us out of trauma because we have the ability to plan and take action about a case or a client or an issue that we need to deal with. Positive self-assessment does not mean you think you're handsome, cute, or popular. It means that you feel like you have a sense of agency, you can make a difference. I don't know anybody in working with people, working with victims, working with young offenders, dealing with difficult circumstances in our culture than people who are really feeling like they can make a difference. People who feel completely powerless don't stay in this work. You all know that the things you do can make a difference in the world, and that's powerful. You have to communicate with people regularly, you have to solve problems, and you have to tolerate and manage strong feelings. And all of those things are protective and help build resilience. So they're another part of the good news. And
Let
that's,
me add something.
go ahead.
Just the presence and use of social support, because it ties into a chat comment that said, never thought about hanging out with people that make me feel good was a trauma tool. So again, I kind of go back to, how did I survive? I successfully survived, not without damage, but I successfully survived a 3-year career, or 30, I'm sorry, a 3-decade career. I can tell you the last decade, one of the greatest assets that I had was not work. It was the fact that I teach an adult Sunday school class, and in my Sunday school class, I have 20 people who have no connection whatsoever to law enforcement or to what I do. I have several teachers and plumbers and an IT guy that works for Lowe's Home Improvement. I have people who have no connection whatsoever, and it is so good for my soul, for my sanity, to spend time away from work, to make that time for something that has, conversations with regular people who have no clue about the horrible things that I see during the week. And for me, that sense of normalcy that I get from being with them, it really helped me a lot. And I think there again, when you get into this trap of only talking to people who get it, or only who feel the same way that you do, or only deal with the same things, you're hurting yourself. You need to go outside your comfort zone. You need to hear people who have different opinions than you, whether it be political or about whatever. And by doing that, you're actually kind of taking some of the pressure off, because it reminds you that there is a normal life out there, and there are good, decent people who aren't hurting kids, or who aren't, beating up their spouses all the time. So I would just really stress that social support is good. And it, whether that's going to a bar to get a beer with your friend, or going to your Sunday school class, or I have several outlets. I'm a scoutmaster, things that have nothing to do with work. That's how I've survived. And that's I can't stress enough how much outside work matters every bit as much as how you handle what you look at inside.
Alan, I love that. I had a husband who would set limits on how long we were allowed to talk about work if we had friends over who did the same kind of work. He'd say, okay, we're done now. We're going to talk about life. And that was very protective for me in the same way. Really powerful.
I hate to use this example because it used to upset me, but now I realize how important it is. But you know, with law enforcement officers, when something happens, a shooting occurs or whatever, our natural tendency is to circle up and protect ourselves and defend because we understand maybe why something happened. And then we hear the questions from the outside. My favorite one being, "Why didn't they just shoot him in the leg?" You know, and it's infuriating. And you get mad, and then you get more defensive. And the cops that are here can understand, but the other folks are going to probably ask, well, yeah, why didn't you shoot him in the leg? But that's kind of the point I'm making. When I have and I go back to my Sunday school class, and 20 people who are close personal friends that have completely different perspectives on things. When a situation occurs or something's in the news, and I hear their questions, and I hear them ask the why didn't they shoot him in the leg question, whatever it might be, and not to harp on that, but it reminds me that good, decent people who love me, who support me, also might have a different point of view, may see it differently, may legitimately have a question, and it kind of makes me pause and kind of step back and say, hey, you know what? We don't all see things the same way. And it is good to kind of remove myself from that intense work environment where everybody's dealing with the same stuff. And you know, not to get too far from our topic today, but it just kind of comes back to, you know, the more people you can exposure to, the more social support you can get from people who have different ideas, the better it's going to help you kind of maintain your sanity and remind you that there's just good people who care about you.
Absolutely, Alan.
That's a good one.
That's a good way to do it. So this slide is just a reminder that trauma and vicarious trauma impact us across all the domains of our being and can impact or intrude on our family and friends, our work, our ability to communicate, our habits, and even our sex lives. So all of these areas can be impacted. We will address briefly some of these areas today, and all of our other webinars will go in depth on each of these additional areas and skills and abilities you can use to help them. So one of the things that we're going to do right now is talk about some coping skills you can use before and during whatever exposure to trauma you might have. So the protect yourself. Think about what you're going to be exposed to. When I would respond on scene to really horrific crimes, I would often use the image in my head of a translucent, semi-permeable bubble that I would put around myself before I would walk on scene. And it would allow information in and out, empathy out, but the yuck would hit the outside of the bubble and fall to the ground. It was something I visualized. It really helped me not take the horrific things from crime scenes home with me. The other thing that's really protective is think about what your task is. Remember that I said work is protective. And that's really important in terms of keeping yourself in the prefrontal cortex and not in the part of your brain where you'll be dumping trauma chemicals. So if you think about what your task is, if you are someone who's a victim advocate or a psychotherapist or someone who's working with people, with youth in a program where you're sitting with them, talking with them, your job is not to visualize what happened to them if they tell you something bad happened to them. Your job is to respond to their emotions, identify what they need. So paying attention to their face, doing that sort of thing. If you're looking online at cyber tips, Your job is not to take in all of the horrible trauma, it's to sort. This one's one of those cases we need to do something about. This one is one that's probably just lucky, but it's not a crime and we don't need to protect anybody right now. So think about what your task is and focus on that. And then the next thing is the ability to de-escalate your personal physiological response, to stop that chemical dump if you know you're feeling trauma. Now, if you're in danger, if somebody's acting out in your program and you have to contain them, if you are a law enforcement officer on a search warrant, if you are somebody working with homeless people on the street and you're at risk for some reason, don't stop your trauma response. It's protective and helpful to you. But if you are doing something where nobody's in danger, my old boss used to say, if nobody's bleeding or unconscious or about to be, it's not a crisis. Then you do this. You think about, where is the tension in your body? I always get it here in my shoulders. We can practice this, and if you all want to do this with me, think about scrunching up your shoulders so they sort of connect to your ears, which is what happens when I get really stressed. Clench your fists, grit your teeth, frown, and then at some point you're going to intentionally let go of that tension. When you let go of that tension, you're communicating to your primitive brain that you're in charge of the tension, somebody's not attacking you. Your posture can change from being kind of pulled in and tense to more open. If you're sitting, like if I'm getting attacked by an attorney on the stand in court, I literally sit up straight, put both my feet on the floor, and put my hands like this in my lap, open. It's communicating to my primitive brain that I'm not in danger, because my primitive brain perceives all of this pulling in as me protecting myself from danger. So you want to open your posture. Think about a cat going belly up. If the cat wants its tummy rubbed, it's very open. If it doesn't, it goes. So undo the, and then you want to think about taking breath, deep breath, all the way down to the bottom of your lungs. If you were in middle school in a choir and your teacher said, sing with your diaphragm, you know that your belly should move when you sing. A deep breath, not a shallow, rapid breath, but slow, deep breaths. If you can put your hands around your belly button in kind of a diamond and feel and take a breath in until your hands move, you know you're getting a full, deep breath. 5 of those will stop that trauma chemical dump. You do them slowly, one at a time. And then the final thing that can shift trauma for us is movement. Now, getting up and walking, those kinds of things can be great. If you're in a closed environment where people won't think you're nuts, shake it off. Shake. Let yourself move. We've learned from animal research that the first thing they do after being traumatized or falling down or being attacked is shake. And we understand now that that does something to reset the primitive part of our brain to let us know that we're no longer in danger, we're back to normal. So shaking it off can actually help.
Gene, are you, proactive trauma prevention, or we got coping skills? So I want to run through these rather quickly because we're short on time, and we've actually got an exercise that we're coming up on that I think we want to focus our time on. But when we talk about coping skills, taking regular breaks, physical movement, planning for next activity, think about your day. Think about, hey, maybe what if I kind of taper things down at the end of the workday? I know that what I typically would do was, I would come in and I would start my workday with the emails and the business kind of things, and then maybe what, content works, dealing with cases or whatever afterwards. Over time, I learned maybe that was a little bit of a backwards way of doing it. Sometimes it might be better to handle the hard stuff up front, and then in the last part of the day, kind of phase that out. So that's something to think about too. You have to figure out your own transitions and rituals and what's going to work for you. but also just movement, getting up and moving every now and then. And we're going to skip ahead to the next slide because, again, we're running short on time, and I want to get to one of the grounding exercises. But Jean, you can take this one, and then we'll move towards the breathing stuff.
Absolutely. So if you do some of these things, you're going to have reduced anxiety and stress. You're going to be better able to focus. And over time, you'll have improvement in your health. One of our participants in the chat said, when I was in a really bad work situation, I had health problems all the time. They're directly corrected because those stress chemicals are kind of like poison when they stay in our body. You're going to be able to keep people longer if they feel like they can manage effectively at work. And you're going to increase the effectiveness of your team, where we may end up hearing more people saying things like, our team runs smoothly, we're strong, we take care of each other. So all of those things are benefits of what we're asking you to do. We just talked about breathing. So I think we can just move to the next slide. A 5-count breath. This is another exercise that tells you how to do one of those deep breaths. A slow inhale. You hold it softly, just briefly. A slow exhale, and then a pause. And then you slow inhale again. So you can use this kind of a technique, and I think we have some of this in some of our materials, to remind you how to do the slow breathing so that you're not doing that rapid trauma-based breathing and you can break up the trauma response. And Alan gets to do his favorite exercise next.
So, and again, it's kind of like the Kelly Clarkson slide. There's just the ones that I really love to get to, and I want to make sure we have time. But when we talk about grounding, and that's a concept I noticed in the comments, grounding yourself, that's something that's good. I have an exercise that I want to go through with you now. We're actually, I would love it if you would do it with me in your own rooms, but I'm going to demonstrate how I might do this. And the thing about a grounding exercise is whatever is spinning around in your head, and I'm a visual person, so I think like spinning literally when I'm stressed or when I'm just really overwhelmed. It does come on gradual, and then there comes this point where it's like all of a sudden I just feel like it's spinning right up here, and I'm spinning out of control, and that's the point where I need to change my channel. And if you think about it like on a television, if what's going on is too busy, change the channel. So this exercise that I'm going to walk you through is to me how I change the channel and how I take it from a really loud, noisy channel to something that's pretty cool and serene. So it's really, we call it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I think this is in your handouts. Well, we're going to do it like this. I'm going to walk through it personally and you observe it with me. And then you kind of get the idea. So starts off, acknowledge 5 things around you. Now, you don't see everything in my room, but I'm just going to go through, and I'll warn you, I'm in a dining room at my home, so there might be a home theme to this. It's going to vary, obviously, depending on where you're working. 5 things around me. I see the blinds on the windows, a portrait of my son when he was 2 years old, cardboard box from Amazon, pencil, a chair. 4 things that I can touch. Paper napkin. A remote control car left by a child. A toy mouse left by a cat. Surface of my table. 3 things that I can hear. Hear the hum of the air conditioner, heat pump running. Distantly in the basement, there's a dehumidifier. Kind of in the distance, truck passing on the highway. 2 things that I can smell. blackberry spice candle. It'd be hard to beat that one. And just off camera, I have it, though. It's a leather pillow. You know, that's one I can go to. And one thing you can taste, and I'll remind you, I am coming to you from the South, North Carolina. So that would be sweet tea.
And Alan, the reason that works is because you are filling your senses with normal positive things rather than the traumatic material that gets stored as sensory information. And that is what helps you de-escalate and relax and become calm again.
It really does come down to changing your channel. It's that simple for me. And I remember so many times feeling like things were spinning. And to me, that's how I visualize it. You may feel it a different way. But for me, when the spinning in my head just becomes too fast and too out of control, I can let it spin me for hours, or I can intentionally take 3 minutes to do a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it changes the channel, and it helps me kind of calm it down and get back under control. And then I'm better prepared to deal with the exact same thing that was overwhelming me just a few minutes before.
That's great. This is a reminder about social support. It doesn't have to be huge during the day. You can just walk into somebody's cube and say, I just need to see a friendly face. You want to walk down and get a cup of tea at the kitchen and we'll walk back. That kind of support can help. And again, if you need to talk, you talk about your feelings, not the trauma. And then we have a handout that you'll be getting in your materials that remind you of some of these things. But one of the really great techniques is called 20-20-20. And you literally look away from your computer every 20 minutes for at least 20 seconds, and you look at least 20 feet away, and that breaks up any of the stuff that's going on in terms of stress or trauma or being tired in your brain, being overtaxed. So little things like that can make a huge difference.
So when we talk about the payoff here, you know, when you have a team, especially that if you're a manager who's working for your team, I really encourage you to dive into this like what I did a few years ago. You're going to reduce the anxiety and stress levels on your team. You're going to reduce your own stress levels. You're going to have a team that's better focused and better able to handle problems. You're going to have an improvement in people's health. Also, the retention of talent. The thing about it, when we push people and we burn them out because it's hard and we're overworked, but we just got to do it. All you're really doing is encouraging people to find something else. So I know in my situation, when I would hire someone on my team, I'd spend 2 years getting them trained, and I'd spend 2 years and about $50,000 to get them where I needed them to be. I didn't need them to leave a year after that, you know? So if you can help people to cope and you know, give them some space as a manager, give them space to do their job and leave them alone, back to the micromanaging thing, um, they're going to be more likely to stick around, and you're actually going to have more retention of talent and in fact increase your effectiveness. It sounds kind of crazy, but by taking more breaks, you're going to get more done. And I have to throw this in. I know we're at the end, but I saw a question earlier that was asked about how do you forgive yourself when you get something wrong or when you make a choice that you feel was the wrong choice for somebody. And you know, I think that's a universal thing. A lot of us, if we make the wrong choice, we tend to be hard on ourselves. But it's so important to understand that we're all humans, and you go at it and you give it the best shot you can. But if you fail, you learn from that and you get it right the next time. But it's you can't hold yourself to the impossible standard of always getting it right. I didn't always get it right, and that's part of the reason I do what I do today. I like to tell you the things that I got wrong, and maybe we can help get it better the next time.
I love that, Alan. That is such an important lesson that mistakes teach us how to do it differently in the future. And if we do that, then it wasn't a wasted mistake. It was something that benefits everybody else we deal with through the rest of our career. And that's a commitment we can make that is a way of paying it back. So if you, I love this. You're putting the tools in. Good for you. And while you're doing that, we'll move on. And one of the things that I think is really important is to remember, just like with mistakes, we want to do this and we're going to do this and this and this. Remember that you're going to have pitfalls. There are going to be days where things don't work well. And don't let that drag you down. Just remember that if you bump into something, the next day is a new day and you can start over again and do it differently that day. Or you can come up with a solution, or you can ask a colleague to help you figure out what to do when you've got a body of water you have to cross without a boat. Those are things that you just need to think about. This is not a all or nothing kind of thing. This is we keep practicing until we get better at it, and we get better at it. And as we get better at it, we can be the lighthouse for someone else who might be lost in their own storm in that moment. So it's all about sharing the positive that comes out of intentionally taking care of yourselves, which is such an important component of vicarious trauma prevention and holding on to and building resilience in ourselves, our teams, and our world. We are, as we said next time, but as we said at the beginning, I think Basilia will probably talk with you about this, going to have a question and answer period next week. And we're doing that because there were so many participants and so many questions before we started, and many that came through the chat. So we'll probably do a better job of answering those questions next week.
Yeah, and again, I'm really excited with how many people we had today and just the incredible diversity of skills and talents and careers. And that's exciting for me. So thank you so much for everyone.
You have our contact information, so if you need to contact for that, and you will be getting information about how to sign up for the Q&A period.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It looks like Basilia might be having connection issues, so I'm just going to jump right in. Thank you all for joining us. I'm just going to wrap up with a few reminders. Since the file share wasn't working earlier, I'm going to pop that up so that you can access the materials for today's event if you didn't have access earlier. So you should see a pop-up on your screen, and a PDF will be showing up there shortly. So that's up there on your screen. If you attended today by yourself in your login, you will be getting an email certificate of attendance directly from WebEx in the next 24 hours. Please make sure you check your spam folder if you don't see it, because it does end up in spam sometimes. You can stay in touch with OJJDP's NTAC by joining our listserv. And I'm just going to roll through all these next slides really quickly because I know we're over on time. If you would like to get in contact with OJJDP, please feel free to reach out to our TTA help desk. The information is on the slide here. And if you have any training or technical assistance needs, you can submit a request via OJJDP's TTA 360 platform, and the information is there on your screen. All right, as a reminder, this event was recorded and it will be posted to OJJDP's YouTube page as well as their multimedia page on their website. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to the OJJDP TTA help desk, and the contact information is there on the slide as well. So these are some upcoming events that you can join. Tomorrow we are holding a webinar for the Preventing Youth Hate Crimes Initiative through OJJDP. That one, the registration information is there on the slide, and there's also a link to more information if you would like to share that. And then on the 24th, we will host a web discussion with our colleagues at the PBS Learning Institute on how probation officers use data. There's also a registration link there. All right, and as mentioned earlier, this is part 1 of a 6-part series. The other dates and topics are listed here on the slide, with the next session coming up on February 16th. And there is also a Q&A session next week, as was mentioned earlier. All right, and with that, we're going to close out today's event. Thank you all so much for joining. We do have all of your questions and answers, and we will be following up with you next week. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you again.